was sent from God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. And the virgin's name was Mary. And he came to her and said, "Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was greatly troubled at the saying, and tried to discern what sort of greeting this might be. And the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God." This is the word of the Lord.
There was a rumor that the world was born in love, before the stars were clothed in fire. A silver thread drawn forth from darkness, a spark of light announced the blaze. An endless void at last surrendered, and at first, the first of days. In gilded panoply arose flaming cherubim, lords of stars, form without matter, thought without weight, descending the ladder to the humblest of paths. And then divine touched flesh, touched sight, the race of man, brought forth from clod, with hand and mind to rule the realm, and soul to see the face of God. But void still raged to claim its child, that ancient bent and stiffened neck, and through deceit and crooked tongue bound up man's gifted breath. Thus the sons of Adam fell to Tartarus's shallow graves, to wait upon the dying flame, when all return from whence they came. But long before the cosmos danced, or ere God set the skies ablaze, there was love, all in all, God from God, the Word proclaimed. Weaving flesh and soul and bone, the Word assumed man's wounded frame, to draw the deadly poison out and carry sin's unlawful claim. But death would forge the sword to strike, the shining heel of heaven's sun. That ancient wound, infected still, inflicted on the Holy One. Yet sin, for all its boasts and lies, bereft of power, was trampled down. For darkness cannot overcome the fire of salvation's crown. Creation groaning in decay rose up anew, alive, reborn. The Word who called life from the deep broke the shame forevermore. There was a rumor that the world was born in love, a whisper spoken true, the Word, the life, the risen one, remaking all things new.
All right. Well, as you may notice, we have now made our third shift in our study of the Gospel of Mark. We started out by talking about how Jesus came to reclaim our lives, to bring them back, to call them back to their original purpose. And then as we got through the Gospel of Mark, we transitioned into how Jesus came to reveal himself as the Messiah, unexpected as it was. He came to reveal himself. And so what we're going to do in this final kind of leg of the Gospel of Mark, these final few chapters, is that we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark in light of one passage that we find in the narrative, in the birth story of Jesus. And so we're calling it from the cradle to the cross. And so each week we're gonna look at a passage And it's a passage in Luke. We're going to read Luke chapter 1, verse 26. It's a passage where the angel Gabriel comes and talks to Mary and tells her about this son that she's about to have. And so we didn't just want to skip the Christmas season and feel like we just kind of headlong into Mark. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this passage and then we're going to compare it to where we're at in the Gospel of Mark and kind of bridge over. Because what we're going to see is that there are things from the beginning that were promised about this son, about this child who was to come, that we're going to see played out in the latter part of Mark's Gospel. And so today, just so you're aware of that, we're going to be in Mark chapter 14. But first, I want to start off by looking a little bit at the passage that Letitia read for us a few minutes ago, and that's in the Gospel of Luke chapter 1, right? And what we're going to see as we look through this is that we're going to see that Jesus' story was part of a plan that was from the beginning of history. God had this plan in mind from the beginning. In fact, if we look to Acts chapter 2, verse 23, Peter is giving a sermon in Acts chapter 2, and he says this. He says, "This Jesus, the one that you had crucified, the one that you had persecuted, the one that you had delivered up," he said, "was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." Even though Jesus was killed by the hands of a human intervention, this was all part of a plan that God had, a definite plan, a plan that was not going to change, a plan that God had had from the beginning. Okay? And so our goal then is to look back at the beginning and see if we can pick up this thread of some similar notes from the beginning all the way to the end. Okay? And so let's begin in chapter 1 of Luke, verse 26, right? And the first thing that we notice in Luke's account is that Mary is confronted by an angel whose name is Gabriel. And so Gabriel comes to Mary, right? She comes to Mary and he has a message for her. And so in verse 26, he says this. It says, "In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to the city of Galilee named Nazareth to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, out of the house of David. And the virgin's name was Mary." Right? And so this angel shows up. And what is Mary's response to this angel? Well, if we look just a little bit further in verse 28 and 29, we find out that Mary is afraid. She's afraid when she sees this angel. And the first thing we realized was true about Mary is true about us. Whenever we are faced with the unknown, there's a fear that wants to creep up inside of each one of us. We fear the unknown. For Mary, it was an angel. It was this unknown being that showed up. And wherever you see angels showing up in the Bible, we don't always get a lot of description about them, but people's response is always fear. There's something that was different about this being, about this angel. And Mary was afraid when she saw this angel. In fact, it's the reason that Gabriel will tell her, "Do not be afraid," because Mary obviously was afraid. And yet, I think one of the things that we pick up in our lives is that when we face unknown situations or unknown things happen in our life, things that aren't according to our plan, things that happen that we're not, that's unusual for us, it can cause great fear. Secondly, we see that we also tend to fear the unexpected. We fear the unexpected. You see, as we read a little bit further on, verse 28, it says, "And he came to her and said, 'Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you.' Yet her response was, but that she was greatly troubled at the saying, and tried to discern what sort of greeting this might be. And the angel said to her, 'Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God.'" See, the second thing is Mary was afraid of the unexpected. Mary probably in no way expected to have an angelic messenger from God come to her and give her this great prophecy, give her this great word that God was going to do something in her life. In fact, Mary probably thought that she would have been the last person that God would have given such a monumental task to. If we think about it for just a second, right? Mary was possibly a teenage girl. She was very young. She was single. She was not married yet. And she was a woman, so in this culture, she had no social status. And so it was outside of Mary's expectation that God would have given her such an incredible gift, such an incredible calling. When you compare that with Elizabeth, who we read about just a little bit earlier in this story, it would have made a lot more sense for God to give Elizabeth this task, right? I mean, Elizabeth was married. Not only was she was married to a priest, and she was older. She had wisdom. She had maturity. And so it seems like she would have been the perfect candidate. But no, God chose to use someone who was unexpected. It's interesting that even after the messenger tells her that she was favored by God, he calls her old favored one, or tells her that she was favored by God, yet there's still fear. If we dive in a little bit further on this word favored, the root of this word is where we get the word grace from. In the Greek, it's the word charis. And if you know anything about grace, what we know about grace is it's something that is unmerited. You did nothing to deserve it. Mary should have seen that, right? She should have understood that God is going to give her this favor, not because she did anything to deserve it, because it's something that God was going to put on her, that's something he was going to give her. But yet, we see so much of ourselves in Mary. When we're faced with the unknown, the unexpected, it causes us to go to fear. And I think we can relate to this, right? I think many of us in our lives disqualify ourselves from something that God wants to do in our lives, right? We say, well, God could never use me because fill in the blank. Maybe I don't have enough of whatever it is. We disqualify ourselves. And yet, as the angel Gabriel comes and reminds her, do not be afraid. Do not fear, because anything's possible with God, right? And so here's where I want us to begin today, right? I want us to take a few minutes and we're going to turn into our groups as we normally do. And I want us to think about this. You may never come face to face with an angel, okay? You may not. Or you may not be called to a monumental task like Mary was. But we all face unknowns and unexpected situations which can cause fear in our life. And so what I want us to do is take a few minutes and talk about some of those unknown or unexpected situations that has caused fear in your life. What are some of the things in your life right now that are keeping you from doing maybe something that you know God has put on your heart to do? What are those things that are just unexpected in your life and they just kind of keep you from doing other things, doing anything? So let's take just a few minutes together in our groups and let's talk about that. And when we come back, we're going to jump over to Mark's gospel and see how Jesus, confronted with a similar situation that was brought fear in his life, how Jesus handled that situation. So let's take a couple minutes together and then we'll come back and look at Mark's account of the gospel. All right, well, so Mary, as we just talked about in Luke's account, Mary finds herself in an unexpected situation that causes great fear in her life. And if we jump over to Mark chapter 14, and we begin in verse 32, we're going to see that Jesus himself was in a situation that caused great fear in him as well. And specifically, if we look at verse 34, right, Jesus makes the phrase in there in verse 34, and we're going to go back through and read all this together in just a minute, but I want to just kind of get our attention to kind of bridge this over there. In verse 34, Jesus says, "And he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death.'" Jesus is in a place that because of what is laying ahead of him, his heart is in a place that he is very sorrowful, even to the point of death. Jesus gives that definition of being scared to death. A literal understanding, right? He's saying that my heart is so broken and so sorrowful for what's about to happen that I feel like I could die. And I know for maybe some of you, you've been in a place very close to that, right? Maybe you know the feeling of lostness or sadness to the point that you just want to give up. I think that's a very real part of the human experience. And Jesus, as Paul says in Philippians 2, is when Jesus kind of emptied himself and took on flesh. Part of that flesh was he took on that human experience. And so Jesus, knowing what is laying ahead of him, is in this place of just fear and desperation, right? The lure of this fear of the unknown and the unexpected are all present in this moment. And yet what we're going to see is that Jesus responds very differently. Jesus, as he always is an example for us of how we respond when the fears of life come on us and they seem so overwhelming that we can't handle it anymore. And so how does Jesus respond to this fear and distraught feelings in his heart? Well, let's take a look and see. So let's start in verse 26. In verse 26. So remember last week we talked about how they had just shared the Passover meal together, right? They just had this reminder, and Jesus had given them the fulfillment of this Passover. He'd showed them the true and full understanding of why this Passover meal existed. It was to find its fulfillment in him, what he was about to do. Verse 26. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Let's just pause right here. I want to note something, right? Jesus was able to worship the Father even in the midst of great sorrow. Have you ever thought about that? Like, Jesus in that moment knew what was about to lay ahead of him. He knew the cross. He knew the separation from the Father. He knew all he was about to endure. And yet before any of that happens, what does he do? He worships. They go out and they sing a hymn together, a song of praise to God. And I just wonder, how do we respond that way when we go through sorrow? Is the first thought in our mind when we go through something hard in life, I just need to praise, I just need to worship the Father? Or are we so consumed with the present emotions and the fears that we're going through that we only think about ourselves? You see, for Jesus, as he goes through this moment, there was a celebration before the sorrow. There was a celebration before the sorrow. But then if we read on, we're going to see that after this celebration, there was a loneliness in the midst of this sorrow. There was intense loneliness in the midst of the sorrow. We're going to see this in verses 27 through 41. Let's start with verse 27. And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter." Jesus is quoting an Old Testament prophecy found in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah 13, verse 7, has this exact quote. That's why Jesus is pulling this. Basically, this idea that there's coming a point when all of those that have followed Jesus, the multitudes, the crowds, and then his beloved disciples, those 11 disciples that have faithfully followed him, even them are going to be scattered in this moment. And Jesus is going to experience this loneliness. Verse 28. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. What's beautiful, though, is that even though Jesus tells his disciples that they're going to scatter, that they're going to abandon him, he also promises them that that's not the end, right? He makes his disciples once again aware of the plan. Now, I don't think he's doing that for them in this moment because they don't get it, right? As we're going to read on in the story, the disciples don't get it in this moment. But there's going to come a moment after Jesus has died and resurrected that they're going to look back on this situation and say, oh, that's it. And it's going to bring extreme hope. It's going to bring so much hope that these group of scared individuals are going to go on to turn the world literally upside down for the gospel. Verse 29 says, "But Peter said to him, 'Even though they all fall away, I will not.' And Jesus said to him, 'Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, 'If I must die with you, I will not deny you.' And they all said the same." Peter, in a way that only Peter does, right? He says, "Jesus, no, I'm never going to be that guy. I don't care if everybody else abandons you. I'm not going anywhere," right? And in one sense, we can look at Peter and we can say, man, here's Peter not getting it again. But I tend to look at this and say, like, I in some ways admire Peter's ambition to want to follow Jesus no matter what, right? Peter steps forward, and I commend Peter for his desire to want to follow Jesus, even though we know how the story goes. Because see, for many of us, we've made statements like that in the past. I mean, do you remember that moment in your life when you first came to know Jesus? And like your heart felt like it was about to explode every time you got into God's word? And you were so passionate and you were so excited. But then something happens over time. You see, we start out by saying things like, "I will follow you anywhere. I will give up anything for you. I will tell anyone about you." But as time goes on, our language changes. We say, "I will follow you anywhere but here. I will give up anything but I will tell anyone," but we begin to put conditions on our devotion. And so I commend Peter in this moment for having just an unadulterated devotion to Jesus, that he was just wholeheartedly wanting to follow Jesus in this moment, yet, as we're going to see, that he misses that. Verse 32, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch.' And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it was possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, 'Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will.' And he came and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak.'" Verse 39, "And again he went and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the 3rd time and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping, taking your rest? It is enough.